The engine died at precisely 5:30 in the morning on December 17, 1944. SS Standartenführer Joachim Peiper sat motionless in the commander's hatch of his Tiger tank as the mechanical growl that had carried his spearhead through the Belgian darkness faded into silence. Around him, in the frozen half-light before dawn, hundreds of vehicles ground to a halt. Panzer IVs, Panthers, Tigers, half-tracks laden with Panzer Grenadiers, supply trucks, armored cars, all became monuments to stillness. The great offensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies and turn the tide of the war had run dry 3 miles into Belgium, stopped not by enemy fire but by the simplest arithmetic of modern warfare. No fuel meant no movement, and no movement meant death. Peiper climbed down from his tank and walked among the stalled column. His breath formed white clouds in the December cold. The men sat in their vehicles or stood beside them, stamping their feet, waiting for orders that could not change physics. They were the elite of the Waffen-SS, veterans of Kharkov and Normandy, soldiers who had learned to fear neither the Russian winter nor the American firepower. But they had not learned to fight without gasoline, and now they sat frozen in a Belgian village called Hansfeld, while somewhere to the west, the Meuse River, their objective, flowed on indifferent to German ambitions. The silence was profound. Peiper had grown accustomed to the constant noise of mechanized warfare, the diesel roar of engines, the clank of treads on frozen ground, the sharp reports of gunfire. Now there was only the wind through the Ardennes forest and the occasional cough of an idling engine being nursed along on fumes. His Kampfgruppe Peiper, the tip of the spear for the entire 6th SS Panzer Army, had become a static display of German technological prowess rendered useless by empty fuel tanks. This was not how the planners had envisioned the offensive. In the bunkers and command posts where Hitler and his generals had conceived Operation Wacht am Rhein, the great winter counteroffensive through the Ardennes, fuel had been reduced to numbers on supply sheets, calculations of consumption rates, and captured stockpiles. The plan had been elegant in its simplicity. Strike through the weakly held Ardennes sector with 3 armies, split the British and American forces, seize the port of Antwerp, force a separate peace with the Western Allies, then turn all resources back to the Eastern Front before the Soviet Colossus could recover from its own massive casualties. Speed was essential. Surprise was assumed, and fuel. Fuel was supposed to be seized from the enemy as the advance rolled forward. Peiper's orders from SS Oberstgruppenführer Sepp Dietrich had been characteristically blunt. Reach the Meuse River bridges within 48 hours. Take fuel where you find it. The Americans have plenty. His Kampfgruppe had been allocated 31,000 gallons of gasoline for a 65-mile thrust through enemy territory. Basic mathematics suggested this was insufficient. A Tiger tank consumed roughly 2.5 gallons per mile under combat conditions. A Panther consumed slightly less. The hundreds of vehicles in Peiper's column would burn through their allocation long before reaching the Meuse, even under ideal conditions. And conditions in the Ardennes in December were anything but ideal. The German High Command had made its calculations based on optimism and desperation in equal measure. They knew the synthetic fuel plants that had sustained the Wehrmacht for years were dying under Allied bombing. They knew the Plough oil fields in Romania had been lost. They knew that every sortie by the Luftwaffe, every kilometer advanced by a panzer division, every supply truck delivering ammunition to the front consumed precious fuel that could not be replaced. But they also knew that not attacking meant slow strangulation. Better to gamble everything on one last throw of the dice than to wait passively for the inevitable. The numbers told a story of irreversible decline. In 1944, Germany produced approximately 33 million barrels of synthetic fuel from its hydrogenation plants. This represented the output of facilities like Luna, Bleckhammer, and Brucks, industrial complexes that had once been the pride of German chemical engineering. But Allied bombing had been systematic and devastating. The United States 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command had made German fuel production a strategic priority. And by December 1944, many of these plants operated at a fraction of capacity, if at all. Some had been rebuilt multiple times only to be destroyed again within weeks. Albert Speer, Reich Minister of Armaments and War Production, had warned Hitler repeatedly about the fuel crisis. In meetings throughout 1944, Speer had presented charts and statistics demonstrating that German fuel stocks were depleting faster than they could be replenished. He had argued that major offensive operations were no longer sustainable, that the Wehrmacht should husband its remaining resources for defensive warfare. Hitler had dismissed these concerns as defeatism. The Führer believed that willpower could overcome material deficiencies, that the superior fighting quality of German soldiers would prevail against numerically superior, but supposedly softer, American forces. This belief was about to be tested against industrial reality. The United States in 1944 produced approximately 1.8 billion barrels of petroleum. This figure represented roughly 60% of global oil production. American refineries pumped out gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel in quantities that would have seemed fantastical to German planners even 5 years earlier. The disparity was not merely quantitative, but qualitative. America's industrial capacity operated without the constant threat of strategic bombing, without the desperate need to disperse production facilities underground, without the requirement to synthesize fuel from coal because natural petroleum was unavailable. As dawn broke over Hansfeld on December 17th, Peiper's frustration crystallized into action. His reconnaissance units had reported the village was held by rear-echelon American troops from the 99th Infantry Division, support personnel and engineers who had bedded down in Belgian homes expecting a quiet sector of the front. Peiper ordered his lead tanks to advance on their remaining fuel. The attack was swift and brutal. American soldiers, many still in sleeping bags when the first shells landed, offered scattered resistance before retreating or surrendering. Within 30 minutes, Hansfeld belonged to Kampfgruppe Peiper, and then, in a farmyard near the center of the village, Peiper's men made their discovery. Stacked in orderly rows, protected by nothing more than canvas tarps weighted down with stones, sat thousands of American jerry cans. Each can bore the olive-drab paint of the United States Army and contained 5 gallons of gasoline. Peiper's supply officers made quick calculations. Approximately 50,000 gallons total, enough to refuel the entire Kampfgruppe and continue the advance. The men set to work immediately, forming chains to pass the heavy cans from the stockpile to the waiting vehicles. The scene had an almost festive quality. Soldiers who moments before had been contemplating the end of their offensive now laughed and joked as they poured American gasoline into German fuel tanks. Tank commanders gunned their engines, listening with satisfaction as the mechanical roar returned. The Tigers and Panthers came back to life, their massive turbines spinning up to operating temperature. Half-tracks that had been pushed to the roadside were refueled and rejoined the column. Peiper himself supervised the operation, ensuring that every vehicle received enough fuel to continue while maintaining a reserve for the headquarters units. But even in this moment of apparent salvation, something gnawed at Peiper's tactical sense. He stood among the jerry cans running calculations in his head. 50,000 gallons was a substantial haul, enough to reach perhaps halfway to the Meuse if fuel consumption remained moderate. But the Americans had left this stockpile behind without apparent concern. They had not destroyed it, had not even attempted to move it. The speed of their retreat suggested they valued their lives more than the fuel, which implied the fuel was not particularly valuable to them. This disturbed Peiper more than he cared to admit. He picked up one of the empty cans and examined it. The manufacturing stamp indicated it had been produced in Ohio in September 1944. 3 months from factory to front. He found another can. Texas, August. Another, Pennsylvania, October. Each can represented not merely 5 gallons of gasoline but an entire logistical chain stretching back across the Atlantic Ocean, back to refineries and factories and oil wells operating at full capacity, untouched by war, pumping out fuel faster than it could be consumed. The Germans had intelligence about American production figures, but confronting the physical evidence, thousands of jerry cans casually abandoned because they were not worth retrieving made those abstract numbers suddenly concrete. Peiper's background was military, not economic. He had joined the Hitler Youth at age 12 and the SS at 19. He had spent his adult life learning the arts of war, tactics, leadership, the maintenance of armored vehicles, the coordination of combined arms assaults. He knew how to read terrain, how to exploit enemy weaknesses, how to push exhausted men to fight beyond their limits. But the war he had trained for, the war of movement and audacity and superior German fighting spirit, was becoming something else. It was becoming a contest of production capacity and logistical depth. And in that contest, Germany was losing so badly that the gap could not be bridged by courage or tactical skill. The German fuel allocation for the entire Ardennes offensive amounted to approximately 5 million gallons. This figure included reserves held at railheads and supply dumps behind the lines, fuel allocated to the 5th Panzer Army and 7th Army, as well as 6th SS Panzer Army, and stockpiles meant to sustain the offensive for 7 to 10 days. 5 million gallons sounded like abundance to men who had spent months operating on fuel rations. It represented weeks of accumulated reserves, fuel scraped together from every available source and husbanded carefully for this decisive moment. But, measured against American logistical capacity, 5 million gallons was almost trivial. The United States First Army, defending the northern shoulder of the Ardennes sector, maintained daily fuel reserves exceeding 4 million gallons. This was not fuel earmarked for an offensive but routine operational reserves maintained during what the Americans considered a quiet period of the war. Allied forces in Western Europe consumed approximately 267 million gallons of gasoline in December 1944 alone. The entire German offensive allocation represented less than 2% of monthly Allied consumption. These ratios were not secret. German intelligence had assembled reasonably accurate estimates of Allied fuel consumption based on traffic analysis, prisoner interrogations, and captured documents. The Wehrmacht leadership knew they were fighting an enemy with vastly superior logistical resources, but knowing this abstractly was different from confronting it operationally. The German plan had relied on capturing Allied fuel dumps as the advance progressed, essentially fueling the offensive with enemy gasoline. This was not traditional military planning, but rather a desperate expedient born of necessity. Peiper's Kampfgruppe resumed its advance through the Ardennes at mid-morning on December 17th. The column stretched for miles along the narrow Belgian roads, a serpent of steel and violence pushing west. The men were in better spirits now, the Tigers and Panthers running smoothly on American gasoline. They passed through villages where civilians watched from windows, unable to flee, unable to resist. They bypassed pockets of American defenders when speed was more important than thoroughness. The plan was to drive deep, to ignore threats to flanks and rear, to reach the Meuse before American reinforcements could seal the breach. But the fuel discovery at Honsfeld had planted a question in Peiper's mind that would not go away. If the Americans could abandon 50,000 gallons without concern, what did their actual supplies look like? His training told him to focus on his mission, to reach his objectives, to maintain momentum. But the soldier in him, the veteran who had survived years of war by understanding both his own capabilities and his enemies, could not ignore what the jerry cans represented. At the next halt, Peiper examined the contents of a captured American supply truck. The vehicle itself was unremarkable. A standard 2.5-ton truck of the type the Americans produced by the tens of thousands, but its cargo manifest told a story. The truck had departed from a depot at Cherbourg on December 10th, 7 days earlier. It had traveled approximately 200 miles to deliver fuel to a forward supply point near Honsfeld. The manifest listed 300 jerry cans, 1,500 gallons total. The truck was one of 67 in its convoy. Simple multiplication suggested that a single convoy had delivered over 100,000 gallons. Peiper found another document, a logistics report from the American V Corps. It detailed fuel consumption for the Corps area during the first week of December, 1.2 million gallons. This was for a single corps during a period of relative quiet, routine patrolling and defensive preparation rather than major offensive operations. The report concluded with a note that supply levels remained adequate and requested no additional allocations for the coming week. The Americans were burning more fuel in routine operations than Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe had been allocated for its decisive breakthrough mission. The contrast became even starker when Peiper's intelligence officers began translating captured American newspapers. Stars and Stripes, the official newspaper of United States forces in Europe, ran articles that would have been unthinkable in German military publications. One story detailed the completion of a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun, capable of pumping 100,000 gallons per day. Another described the Red Ball Express, the truck convoy system that had sustained Allied forces during the pursuit across France in summer 1944. The article noted that at peak operation, the Express had delivered approximately 400,000 gallons of fuel daily over 400 miles of French roads. These were not military secrets, but rather stories published for enlisted men's reading, descriptions of logistical operations considered newsworthy because of their scale, but not sensitive enough to warrant censorship. The Germans, reading these papers in Belgian villages, had been rationing fuel by the liter for months. They had watched the Luftwaffe grounded because aviation fuel was unavailable. They had seen panzer divisions immobilized for lack of diesel, and now they held newspapers casually describing American logistical operations that moved more fuel in a day than the Wehrmacht had allocated to entire offensives. The United States Army Transportation Corps operated approximately 40,000 trucks in the European theater of operations by December 1944. These vehicles formed the backbone of Allied logistics, shuttling supplies from ports to forward depots to frontline units in continuous streams. Each truck could carry approximately 1,500 gallons of gasoline in jerry cans. A single round trip from port to front might take 3 to 5 days depending on distance and road conditions. The mathematics of this system were inexorable. Thousands of trucks moving continuously meant millions of gallons delivered weekly, fuel arriving faster than frontline units could consume it. The Germans had nothing comparable. Wehrmacht logistics relied heavily on railroads, which were efficient for bulk transport but vulnerable to interdiction and unable to provide the flexibility of trucks. German motor transport was itself constrained by fuel shortages, creating a vicious cycle where trucks needed to conserve fuel even while trying to deliver fuel to combat units. The disparity in truck production alone told much of the story. American factories built approximately 800,000 trucks in 1944. German production in the same period amounted to approximately 88,000. Peiper understood, perhaps better than his superiors in their distant headquarters, that he was fighting a fundamentally different war than the one German doctrine had been designed for. The Wehrmacht's theory of mobile warfare, the blitzkrieg concept that had shattered Poland and France, presumed relatively short advances against enemies who could be defeated before logistical constraints became critical. It worked when campaigns could be measured in weeks and victories in miles advanced per day. It failed when the enemy possessed the industrial capacity to absorb losses and rebuild faster than Germany could inflict damage. The Americans had arrived in France with a logistical infrastructure built for wars of attrition and industrial grinding. Their planning assumed long campaigns, massive material consumption, continuous reinforcement, and resupply. They had constructed an artificial harbor at Arromanches when the channel ports remained in German hands. They had built pipelines across the English Channel. They had organized supply systems that treated fuel like water, abundant and expendable. The German offense crashed against this system like a wave against a concrete seawall. By the evening of December 17th, Peiper's Kampfgruppe had advanced approximately 30 miles, fighting through scattered American resistance and maintaining surprising momentum. They had seized additional fuel at Billingen, another American supply dump that yielded perhaps 30,000 gallons. The men were exhausted but exhilarated. The offensive was working. They were pushing deep into American-held territory, creating chaos and confusion, threatening to achieve the breakthrough that would split the Allied line. But Peiper kept returning to those shipping manifests, those newspapers, those casual references to logistics that would have been fantastical to German planning staffs. He did the arithmetic repeatedly, checking his calculations, hoping he had made an error. He had not. Even if Kampfgruppe Peiper reached the Meuse, even if they seized the bridges intact, even if they accomplished everything the plan envisioned, they would arrive with empty fuel tanks and no means to continue. The offensive that was supposed to reverse Germany's fortunes was running on borrowed fuel, literally consuming the enemy's gasoline to fight the enemy, and that paradox contained the seeds of inevitable defeat. The Americans Peiper encountered seemed almost bewildered by German fuel scarcity. Prisoner interrogations revealed that junior officers had been instructed to destroy fuel dumps if threatened, but that many had simply fled without implementing demolition orders. The fuel seemed too abundant to be worth dying for. One captured captain expressed genuine puzzlement when asked about German fuel situation. He had assumed any modern army would have adequate fuel supplies. The concept that Germany might launch a major offensive while literally unable to fuel that offensive struck him as absurd, almost incompetent. This incomprehension reflected a deeper truth about the industrial warfare of the mid-20th century. The Allied planners in London and Washington had built their strategies on the foundation of American industrial output. They knew the production figures, the shipping tonnages, the consumption rates. They planned operations assuming adequate supplies because adequate supplies were always available. Scarcity was not part of their operational vocabulary. When American units consumed more fuel than projected, supply officers requested additional allocations and received them. When pipelines proved insufficient, more were built. When truck convoys experienced delays, more trucks were assigned. The system responded to demand by expanding supply. Germany's war economy operated under opposite constraints. Every resource was scarce. Every allocation meant another use went unfunded. Speer's Armaments Ministry had achieved remarkable production increases during 1943 and 1944, but these gains were tactical responses to strategic decline. More tanks were built in 1944 than in any previous year of the war, but the metal allocated to tank production came at the expense of other critical needs. More fighters rolled off production lines, but they sat grounded for lack of aviation fuel. The economy was cannibalizing itself, prioritizing immediate needs while undermining long-term sustainability. The synthetic fuel plants that were supposed to free Germany from dependence on foreign oil had become targets too valuable to ignore. Throughout 1944, Allied bombers returned again and again to facilities like Luna, the massive hydrogenation complex near Mersburg that had once produced 18% of Germany's total fuel output. The Americans bombed during daylight with precision-aimed strikes. The RAF followed with nighttime area bombing. German repair crews worked frantically to restore production after each raid, sometimes bringing facilities back online within weeks. Then the bombers returned. The bombing campaign's effects cascaded through German operations. Luftwaffe squadrons that had once ruled European skies remained grounded while Allied aircraft operated with impunity. Panzer divisions that had terrorized enemy infantry found themselves immobilized for lack of diesel. Training programs for pilots and tank crews were curtailed because running exercises consumed fuel needed for combat operations. Germany was becoming a military power in name only, possessing weapons it could not fuel, armies it could not move, aircraft it could not fly. Peiper's men, advancing through Belgium on American gasoline, represented the absurd endpoint of this trajectory. They were elite troops, veterans of the Eastern Front, equipped with some of the finest tanks Germany could produce. They fought with skill and determination, and they did so while dependent on enemy fuel to continue their attack against that same enemy. The operational paradox was complete. Germany was reduced to capturing enemy supplies to sustain an offensive aimed at defeating the enemy, who possessed those supplies in abundance. On December 18th, as Kampfgruppe Peiper approached Stavelot and the critical bridges over the Amblev River, Peiper reviewed his fuel situation one final time. His Kampfgruppe had consumed approximately 80,000 gallons since crossing the German frontier 2 days earlier. They had captured approximately 80,000 gallons from American depots at Honsfeld and Billingen. The arithmetic suggested they had made no net progress in fuel accumulation, despite advancing 30 miles and seizing enemy stockpiles. Every gallon captured had been immediately consumed to fuel further advance. They were running faster simply to stay in place. Ahead lay the Meuse River, approximately 30 miles distant. Behind lay a supply line that was already under attack from American forces closing in on the flanks of the German advance. The fuel allocation that was supposed to sustain the breakthrough had proven inadequate from the start. The captured American fuel had granted temporary reprieve, but not actual solution. And somewhere ahead, Peiper knew, American forces were preparing defenses, organizing counterattacks, and, most critically, moving supplies and reinforcements with a logistical ease that Germany could not match. The Americans could afford to abandon fuel dumps at Hansfeld because losing 50,000 gallons meant nothing to their overall supply situation. The Americans could retreat before Peiper's advance because they knew reinforcements were coming, supplied by trucks that ran on fuel from pipelines that ran from ports that received tankers from refineries that produced more in a day than Germany produced in a month. The mathematics were elegant and brutal in their simplicity. America possessed oceans of petroleum while Germany operated on drops carefully hoarded and desperately stretched. Peiper understood this truth on the morning of December 18th as his spearhead prepared to assault Stavelot. He understood that even if everything went perfectly, even if his Kampfgruppe seized the Meuse bridges intact, even if they scattered American defenders and created the breakthrough that Hitler envisioned, they would arrive at their objectives with empty tanks and no means to exploit success. The offensive that was supposed to change the war's trajectory would instead demonstrate why the war was already lost. Germany had misread its enemy not in terms of courage or tactical skill but in terms of industrial capacity and logistical depth. That misreading was about to become catastrophically clear. What Peiper discovered in those abandoned American fuel dumps was not salvation, but verdict. The jerry cans with their casual markings, the shipping manifests showing casual abundance, the newspapers describing pipeline construction. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. Germany was fighting an industrial power that could afford to be wasteful because its abundance rendered waste insignificant. America shipped fuel across an ocean, trucked it hundreds of miles, stockpiled it in forward depots, and then abandoned it to advancing Germans because retrieving it was more trouble than producing more. That calculus, more than any single battle or brilliant tactical maneuver, would determine how the war ended. The fuel depot at Stavelot held 2 million gallons. It sat in a valley 300 yards from the Amblève River Bridge, a collection of above-ground storage tanks surrounded by a chain-link fence. The morning of December 18th broke clear and cold, and Captain John Brewster of the United States Army Corps of Engineers stood on a hillside overlooking the depot, watching Peiper's lead tanks approach from the east. Brewster had orders to deny the fuel to the Germans. He had prepared demolition charges at the bridge but had been uncertain whether to destroy the depot itself. 2 million gallons represented significant value even to an army with abundant supplies. But watching the German column approach, seeing the tigers and panthers that had smashed through American defenses, Brewster made his decision. The engineers had rigged improvised incendiaries, thermite charges placed among the storage tanks with detonation cords running back to a control point on the hillside. Brewster gave the order. The charges detonated with flat cracks that echoed off the valley walls. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the gasoline ignited. The fire started as discrete flames at each tank, orange and yellow against the white snow. Then the flames merged into a single conflagration that rose hundreds of feet into the December sky. The heat was intense enough that Brewster felt it on the hillside, felt his face burn even at 300 yards distance. The smoke rose in a black pillar visible for miles. Peiper's advance guard halted at the edge of Stavelot, tanks idling, watching the fuel depot burn. There was nothing tactical about the fire, nothing that could be analyzed in terms of fields of fire or avenues of approach. It was simply 2 million gallons of gasoline burning because the Americans preferred to destroy it rather than risk its capture. The flames burned for 3 days. By the time they exhausted themselves, the storage tanks were twisted metal husks and the ground was scorched black. 2 million gallons had been converted into smoke and ash and heat that dissipated uselessly into the Belgian winter. For Peiper's men, watching that pillar of smoke rise, the symbolism was inescapable. The Americans could afford to burn 2 million gallons, approximately 40% of the total fuel Germany had allocated to the entire Ardennes offensive. simply to deny it to the enemy. This was not careful husbanding of scarce resources, but industrial warfare in its purest form. Destroy what you cannot hold, because replacing it costs less than letting the enemy have it. The fire at Stavelot demonstrated abundance as brutally as any battlefield victory. America was so rich in petroleum that it burned oceans of fuel rather than let drops fall into German hands. Peiper ordered the assault on Stavelot to continue. His Kampfgruppe needed those bridges to maintain momentum toward the Meuse. The fighting was bitter. American defenders from the 30th Infantry Division held buildings and contested every street. German infantry cleared houses with grenades and close-quarter fighting. The Tigers advanced through narrow streets where their size became a liability, unable to traverse their main guns, vulnerable to bazookas fired from upper windows. The bridge was eventually taken, but only after hours of combat that consumed precious time and fuel. Beyond Stavelot, the roads deteriorated. What maps had shown as improved highways proved to be narrow country lanes, winding through forests and between steep hillsides. The massive Tigers and Panthers struggled on roads designed for farm vehicles. Fuel consumption increased dramatically as engines strained to push 60-ton vehicles up grades and around tight curves. Peiper's fuel officers recalculated consumption rates and reported grim news. The Kampfgruppe was burning 2.5 gallons per mile under these conditions, higher than any planning estimate. At this rate, the fuel captured at Hunsfeld and Bullingen would be exhausted before they reached the Meuse. The tactical situation began to deteriorate in parallel with the fuel situation. American resistance stiffened as the surprise of the initial assault wore off. The 82nd Airborne Division was rushed to the area, elite troops who knew how to fight German armor without panicking. The roads behind Peiper's advance became contested as American forces closed in from north and south. Supply trucks attempting to reach the Kampfgruppe were turned back or destroyed. Peiper's spearhead, which had been designed to punch through and link up with follow-on forces, instead found itself increasingly isolated. On December 19th, Kampfgruppe Peiper reached the village of L'Église. Here, the advance finally stalled. The Americans had established blocking positions on all the western approaches. Peiper's reconnaissance patrols reported American tanks and tank destroyers in prepared positions. Infantry dug in with anti-tank guns. Artillery registered on approach routes. Fighting through would be possible but would consume ammunition and fuel that could not be replaced. The Meuse, the objective that had seemed achievable 72 hours earlier, now lay beyond reach. Peiper established defensive positions at L'Église and radioed his division headquarters requesting resupply. The response confirmed what he already knew. No fuel convoys were getting through. The roads behind were blocked by American forces. The Luftwaffe, which was supposed to provide air support and supply drops, was absent. The offensive's timetable, which had assumed rapid advance and continuous resupply, had collapsed under the friction of actual combat. Kampfgruppe Peiper was stranded 35 miles from its start line and 10 miles from its objective, out of fuel and out of options. The men began abandoning vehicles to conserve fuel for those still mobile. Trucks were drained and left beside the road. Damaged tanks that might have been repaired were stripped of usable parts and destroyed to prevent capture. The Kampfgruppe that had numbered hundreds of vehicles shrank daily as fuel exhaustion did what American firepower had not managed. Each abandoned vehicle represented not just a tactical loss, but a visible marker of logistics overcoming combat effectiveness. German soldiers writing in diaries and letters during this period expressed a sense of disillusionment that went beyond tactical reverses. They described watching American units maneuver with apparent freedom, while German forces counted every liter of fuel. They noted American artillery fire that seemed unlimited in volume compared to German batteries rationing shells. They observed American aircraft overhead while the Luftwaffe remained absent. The cumulative weight of these observations eroded the psychological superiority that had sustained German forces through earlier campaigns. One panzer grenadier wrote home describing American soldiers he had seen as prisoners. They had been captured wearing clean uniforms with full equipment. They had possessed rations that included luxuries like chocolate and cigarettes. They had spoken casually about when replacement supplies would arrive. as if resupply was so certain as to be unremarkable. The Panzer Grenadier contrasted this with his own situation, wearing the same uniform for weeks, eating emergency rations, uncertain when food would next arrive. The material disparity translated directly into morale. The myth of German technological and tactical superiority, carefully cultivated by propaganda and partially validated by early war successes, dissolved in the Ardennes mud and snow. German soldiers had been told they were fighting for a superior civilization against decadent democracies. They had believed that German engineering and military professionalism would prevail against numerically superior, but qualitatively inferior enemies. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated that numbers mattered, that industrial capacity mattered, that logistics mattered more than ideology or fighting spirit. American responses to the German offensive reflected abundant resources applied systematically. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were trucked to the Ardennes from rest areas, a movement of approximately 20,000 men plus equipment accomplished in under 24 hours. This rapid deployment required hundreds of trucks and thousands of gallons of fuel, all deployed without disrupting normal supply operations elsewhere on the front. The Americans could respond to crisis by adding resources rather than by robbing Peter to pay Paul. The airlift to Bastogne, beginning December 23 when weather cleared, demonstrated Allied logistical capacity even more starkly. C-47 transport aircraft flew through contested airspace to drop supplies to surrounded American forces. Over 4 days, the airlift delivered approximately 800 tons of supplies including ammunition, medical supplies, and fuel. The fuel delivered to Bastogne in 4 days exceeded what Kampfgruppe Peiper had been allocated for its entire offensive. The Americans flew in more fuel than Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe possessed, not because Bastogne needed it desperately, but because they could. Ultra intercepts, the decoded German communications that Allied intelligence read throughout the war, revealed that British and American commanders understood German fuel shortages from the offensive's first days. Decrypted messages showed German units desperately requesting fuel, reporting vehicles abandoned for lack of diesel, pleading for resupply that never came. The Allied response was to target fuel supplies systematically. Fighter bombers attacked German supply columns. Artillery fired on suspected fuel dumps. The plan was to let the Germans advance until they ran dry, then counterattack when they were immobilized. This strategic approach reflected fundamental differences in how the two sides conceived operations. German planning for the Ardennes assumed that audacity and surprise could compensate for material shortages. The plan relied on capturing enemy supplies, on maintaining such rapid tempo that the enemy could not organize effective resistance, on achieving strategic objectives before logistical constraints became fatal. It was a gambler's strategy, all in on a single throw because slow, steady play was no longer viable. Allied planning assumed that material superiority would eventually prevail. The Americans and British knew they could afford to trade space for time, to fall back and reorganize, to absorb losses and replace them, to fight battles of attrition that wore down enemies who could not sustain equivalent losses. Their strategies were conservative in the sense of risking less on single operations, but that conservatism was possible only because of underlying abundance. An army that can replace losses can afford to fight carefully. An army that cannot must gamble on quick victories. The industrial mathematics underlying these operational approaches were stark. Germany, in December 1944, was producing approximately 7,000 barrels of aviation fuel daily from all remaining synthetic plants. This production sustained operations on both the eastern and western fronts, plus training and transport requirements. The United States produced approximately 350,000 barrels of aviation fuel daily, approximately 50 times German output. This ratio meant one American bomb group could fly more sorties in a day than the entire Luftwaffe could sustain operationally. Similar disparities existed across every category of supply. American ammunition production measured in millions of shells monthly. American tank production ran at approximately 2,000 vehicles monthly. American truck production exceeded German output by factors of 10 or more. And behind all of this was American petroleum. 1.8 billion barrels annually versus Germany's 33 million from synthetic sources. The numbers were not close. They were not competitive. They represented qualitatively different industrial ecosystems, one operating at full capacity and safety, the other being systematically destroyed from the air while trying to sustain total war. German soldiers began to understand these ratios not through briefings or intelligence reports, but through direct observation. They saw American soldiers using gasoline to heat water for shaving and washing. They found American units that had erected shower facilities supplied by fuel-fired heaters. They discovered that American trucks often ran continuously because starting a cold engine was harder than leaving it idling, and fuel was plentiful enough that this waste was acceptable. Each of these observations, trivial in itself, contributed to a growing realization that Germany was fighting an enemy for whom scarcity was not part of operational vocabulary. The psychological impact of this realization was profound. German military culture emphasized discipline, duty, sacrifice in service of the state. Soldiers were taught that hardship built character, that accepting privation was honorable, that material comfort was less important than spiritual strength. These values had sustained the Wehrmacht through the Russian winter and the grueling defensive battles in Italy and France, but they offered no answer to an enemy who possessed both material abundance and the will to fight. The Americans were not decadent weaklings corrupted by luxury. They were well-fed, well-equipped soldiers backed by industrial capacity that could overwhelm German positions through sheer volume of firepower. Peiper's situation at L'Église deteriorated through December 22nd and 23rd. American artillery pounded German positions continuously. Tank destroyers firing from long range picked off German tanks that exposed themselves. Infantry probes tested defenses and eliminated outposts. The Kampfgruppe was dying by attrition, losing men and vehicles hourly without ability to maneuver or counterattack effectively. The fuel shortage that had seemed like a temporary embarrassment had become an existential crisis. On December 23rd, Peiper made the decision to attempt a breakout on foot. His men would abandon all heavy equipment, destroy their vehicles to prevent capture, and attempt to infiltrate back through American lines to German positions. The order was devastating to morale. These were men who had served in armored units, who identified with their panzers, who saw themselves as mobile elite troops. Reducing them to infantry, asking them to abandon their vehicles and walk out, felt like defeat, even though tactically it was the only option remaining. The breakout began after dark on December 23rd. Peiper's men moved in small groups, navigating through American positions using darkness and forest as cover. They left behind at L'Église approximately 40 tanks and armored vehicles. Over 100 other vehicles, most of their heavy weapons and equipment. German engineers rigged demolition charges to destroy what could not be taken. The explosions that destroyed these vehicles marked the end of Kampfgruppe Peiper as an effective military force. Approximately 800 men reached German lines over the following days. They had started the offensive with over 4,000. Some had been killed in combat. Some were captured. Many were left behind wounded when the breakout occurred. The survivors were exhausted, frostbitten, demoralized. They had accomplished nothing of strategic value. They had advanced 35 miles into Belgium and then walked back. The offensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies and reach Antwerp had stalled for want of gasoline 35 miles from its start point. The massacres that occurred during Kampfgruppe Peiper's advance have remained controversial. At Malmedy on December 17th, approximately 84 American prisoners of war were shot. Similar incidents occurred at other locations along Peiper's route. These war crimes emerged from the desperation and brutality of the campaign, but also from the recognition that the offensive was failing. Units unable to spare men to guard prisoners, unable to spare time to process surrenders, resorted to murder as expedient. The atrocities reflected the broader collapse of civilized conduct that accompanied military defeat. After the war, Joachim Peiper stood trial for the Malmedy massacre. The trial proceedings held at Dachau in 1946 exposed the complexity of command responsibility and war crimes prosecution. Peiper maintained he had not directly ordered prisoners killed, but acknowledged that killings occurred under his command. The court found him guilty and sentenced him to death. The sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment, then further reduced. Peiper was released from Landsberg prison in 1956 after serving 11 years. His life after prison was difficult. He lived under a cloud, recognized as a war criminal, followed by attention he did not welcome. He eventually moved to France, to a small village in the Haute-Saône region, seeking anonymity. He could not escape his past. On July 13, 1976, his house was attacked. Assailants fired shots and threw Molotov cocktails. The house burned. Peiper died in the fire, either from burns or smoke inhalation or possibly from gunshot. He was 61 years old. The killers were never identified. The investigation suggested French communists or individuals connected to wartime resistance movements, people for whom Peiper represented unpunished Nazi crimes. In a 1967 interview, one of the last he gave before retreating from public life, Peiper reflected on the Ardennes offensive. He spoke carefully, aware that his words would be scrutinized, but he acknowledged what he had learned in December 1944. He said that the Germans had discovered that the Americans possessed oceans while Germany possessed drops. He described the realization that material abundance ultimately determined military outcomes regardless of tactical skill or soldier quality. He did not frame this as excuse but as observation, a professional soldier's assessment of why the offensive failed. This observation contained larger truths about the nature of industrial warfare. The First World War had demonstrated that modern combat consumed resources at rates unprecedented in history. Millions of shells were fired in single battles. Casualties reached levels that would have destroyed entire previous-era armies. Victory went not necessarily to the side with better generals or braver soldiers, but to the side that could sustain losses and replace them faster than the enemy. The Second World War amplified these dynamics through mechanization and air power, creating wars where logistical capacity became as important as battlefield prowess. Germany entered the Second World War with military excellence but constrained resources. The Wehrmacht was superbly trained and equipped in 1939, capable of executing complex operations with precision. But Germany lacked the natural resources to sustain prolonged total war against multiple industrialized enemies. The synthetic fuel programs, the ersatz materials, the elaborate systems for extracting maximum output from limited resources, all represented attempts to compensate for fundamental scarcity. These efforts were impressive, but ultimately insufficient. The Battle of the Bulge exposed this insufficiency completely. Germany committed its last operational reserves, assembled a powerful striking force, achieved surprise, and executed its offensive according to plan. And the offensive collapsed not because American soldiers fought better, or because German tactics failed, but because Germany could not fuel its own advance. The simple arithmetic of gallons consumed versus gallons available determined outcomes more surely than any battlefield decision. Peiper's Tigers, stopped for lack of fuel at Hansfeld on December 17th, revealed the central truth. Germany was fighting a war its economy could not sustain. The Allied response demonstrated the opposite condition. When the German offensive threatened to break through American lines, the response was to commit more resources. More divisions trucked to the Ardennes, more aircraft committed to ground support once weather cleared, more ammunition shipped to artillery batteries, more fuel delivered to forward depots. The American and British forces could respond to crisis by scaling up, by adding resources, by overwhelming the problem with material rather than relying on brilliance or desperate gambles. This capacity for scaling reflected economic fundamentals unchanged by military innovation. The United States entered the war with the world's largest economy, a manufacturing base operating at peacetime levels of output, vast natural resources including oil deposits that supplied 60% of global consumption. Converting this economy to war production created industrial output on scales previously unimagined. The statistics almost seem unbelievable. 300,000 aircraft built during the war, 80,000 tanks, 2.5 million trucks, 40 billion rounds of ammunition. And behind all of this production was energy, petroleum refined into gasoline and diesel and aviation fuel. the lifeblood of mechanized warfare. Germany possessed none of these advantages. It fought surrounded by enemies, its industries under constant air attack, dependent on synthetic production of resources others extracted from the ground. Every gallon of fuel Germany produced required tons of coal, processed through complex chemical reactions at facilities that became priority bombing targets. Every ton of synthetic rubber Germany produced came at the cost of other production forgone. The economy was a zero-sum system where increases in one category meant decreases in others. By December 1944, that system was collapsing. Synthetic fuel production had been cut to less than 30% of peak output. Ball bearing production, critical for aircraft and vehicle manufacture, had been disrupted by systematic bombing. Transportation networks were degrading as locomotives and rail cars were destroyed faster than they could be replaced. The Wehrmacht still fielded millions of soldiers and retained significant combat power, but the industrial foundation supporting those forces was crumbling. The Ardennes offensive represented Hitler's attempt to reverse this decline through operational success. If the offensive could split the Allied armies, recapture Antwerp, force the Western Allies into negotiating a separate peace, Germany might gain time to rebuild and redeploy forces to stop the Soviet advance from the east. The logic was not entirely unreasonable given Germany's desperate situation. Doing nothing meant slow defeat. Attacking offered at least the possibility of changing the strategic equation, but the plan required succeeding before logistical constraints became binding, and those constraints were binding from the start. The fuel allocation was insufficient. The assumption that enough American fuel could be captured proved incorrect. The terrain was worse than expected. The weather prevented air support. American resistance was more effective than anticipated. Every variable that could work against the offensive did work against it, and the cumulative effect was to expose the fundamental weakness in German strategic position. Peiper's abandoned Tiger tank at L'Église became a memorial and later a museum piece. It sits today where it was left in December 1944, a massive vehicle painted in German wartime camouflage, its fuel gauge frozen on empty. Tourists photograph it. Historians examine it. The tank embodies the meeting of tactical excellence and logistical reality, of fighting spirit and industrial mathematics. It is a monument to the moment when a superbly engineered weapon of war became immobile for want of gasoline, when 60 tons of steel and armor and firepower became irrelevant because the fuel tank was dry. The lessons of the Ardennes have been studied extensively by military historians and strategists. The tactical level of war, the movements of units, the decisions of commanders, the fighting quality of soldiers, receives detailed analysis. But the strategic level, the domain of industrial capacity and resource availability, often receives less attention despite being more determinative. The Battle of the Bulge demonstrated that in modern warfare, factories matter more than fortresses, pipelines more than panzer tactics, and industrial production more than individual courage. These lessons have implications beyond historical analysis. Modern military forces remain dependent on fuel for mobility and firepower. Armies still require continuous resupply of ammunition, spare parts, food, and fuel. The side that can maintain these supply lines, that possesses the industrial base to replace losses, that has secured access to necessary resources, retains decisive advantages regardless of tactical circumstances. The fundamentals that defeated Germany in the Ardennes remain relevant to contemporary warfare. The oil fields that supplied Allied forces during World War II continue to influence geopolitics decades later. Control of petroleum resources shapes international relationships, drives military interventions, determines economic power. The disparity between America's 1.8 billion barrels and Germany's 33 million foreshadowed global dynamics that persist into the 21st century. Energy security remains a strategic priority for nations precisely because lack of it proved fatal to Germany's war effort. Peiper himself understood in the Ardennes what many German leaders refused to accept until the war's end: that Germany was fighting enemies whose industrial capacity could not be overcome by fighting spirit or tactical innovation. His post-war reflection about oceans versus drops captured this understanding. The Americans did not defeat Germany merely by fighting better. They defeated Germany by outproducing, outsupplying, and overwhelming through sheer material abundance. The burning fuel depot at Stavelot, 2 million gallons destroyed because keeping it from German hands mattered more than the cost, symbolized this abundance in its most elemental form. The war ended 5 months after the Ardennes offensive collapsed. Germany surrendered unconditionally in May 1945. The surrender came after Soviet armies overran Berlin from the east and Allied forces pushed into southern Germany from the west. By that point, German armed forces were shadows of their former strength, units existing on paper but lacking fuel, ammunition, and often basic supplies. The industrial infrastructure that might have sustained resistance had been bombed into rubble. The synthetic fuel plants were offline or captured. The transportation network had ceased functioning. Germany, as an organized military power, simply ceased to exist. In the ruins of that defeat, the Ardennes offensive could be seen clearly for what it was. Not a near success defeated by bad luck or mistakes, but a fundamentally unsound operation launched because alternatives were worse. The offensive gambled everything on achieving breakthrough before resources ran out. It lost that gamble not in a single decisive battle but through the accumulated friction of logistics, through fuel gauges reading empty, through supply columns that never arrived, through the simple mathematics that 2.5 gallons per mile times 35 miles times hundreds of vehicles equals more fuel than was available. The soldiers who fought in the Ardennes, on both sides, wrote memoirs and gave interviews describing their experiences. German veterans often expressed a sense of betrayal, feeling they had been sent into battle with inadequate support and impossible objectives. American veterans described the shock of the initial assault giving way to confidence as they realized German forces were overextended and undersupplied. Both perspectives captured partial truths. The German soldiers were indeed betrayed, not by their commanders alone but by the entire strategic situation that required attempting the impossible. The American soldiers were indeed justified in their confidence, backed by industrial systems that could absorb the initial shock and respond with overwhelming force. Joachim Peiper's story, from commanding elite SS troops to burning to death in a French cottage, traces one trajectory through this larger historical moment. He was a skilled tactician, a veteran of brutal campaigns, a man shaped by Nazi ideology and military professionalism in equal measure. His war crimes cannot be excused by military necessity. His tactical competence did not justify the massacres committed under his command, but his recognition in the Ardennes of what Germany was really fighting against, not just Allied armies but Allied industrial capacity, marked a moment of clarity about the nature of the war. The Tiger tank at L'Église, fuel gauge on empty, stands as monument to that clarity. It represents the end of romantic notions about warfare, the death of ideas that individual heroism or tactical brilliance could overcome material disadvantage. It marks the point where modern war revealed its true nature, a contest of production capacity and logistical systems, where victory went to the side that could sustain consumption rather than the side that fought most bravely or maneuvered most cleverly. In the broader sweep of the Second World War, the Battle of the Bulge was a relatively minor operation. It delayed Allied victory by weeks rather than months. It inflicted casualties but did not change strategic outcomes. Its importance lies not in what it accomplished militarily, but in what it revealed about the nature of industrial warfare. Germany's last major offensive in the West collapsed not because soldiers failed to fight, but because the fundamental arithmetic of fuel consumption and supply availability determined outcomes more certainly than any battlefield decision. This truth extends beyond one battle in Belgium in December 1944. It illuminates the entire war and perhaps modern warfare generally. The side with more factories producing more weapons supplied by more resources transported by more trucks fueled by more petroleum wins, wars of attrition. Tactical excellence matters. Strategy matters. Leadership and morale and training all matter. But they matter within constraints set by industrial capacity and resource availability. When one side possesses oceans and the other possesses drops, the outcome becomes mathematically predetermined regardless of how bravely the soldiers fight or how brilliantly the commanders maneuver. Joachim Peiper discovered this truth in the Ardennes, discovering it through the abandoned American jerrycans at Honsfeld, through the burning depot at Stavelot, through the fuel gauges reading empty at La Glaise. His Tiger tank, abandoned when the gasoline ran out, memorializes that discovery. It stands as reminder that wars are won by factories and fuel, not by faith or fury, and that tactical brilliance in the absence of adequate logistics is merely prelude to defeat. The Battle of the Bulge proved this principle completely. Germany's finest troops executing carefully planned operations collapsed when they ran out of gasoline, stopped not by enemy fire but by empty fuel tanks, defeated by the simple arithmetic that modern war requires more resources than courage alone can provide.